From the very beginning, their lives seemed like they belonged to two different worlds. Yet, strangely, they were shaped by the same kind of hopes, dreams, and early struggles. Tupac Shakur grew up surrounded by ideas, discussions, and strong beliefs. His family was not wealthy, but they were rich in purpose. His mother taught him about courage, truth, and speaking up for people who needed a voice. Tupac learned early that words could create change. They could move people, comfort them, and remind them that they were not alone. Michael Jackson, on the other hand, walked into the world of music before he was even old enough to understand the meaning of fame. He grew up in a busy home full of brothers, rehearsals, and constant practice. While other children played freely in parks, Michael spent his days on stage, in recording rooms, and in front of cameras. His childhood was not normal, but it was full of dreams that slowly turned into reality. With every song, every move, every smile, he gained more fans, and his voice became known all around the world. Even though both men came from humble beginnings, the roads they took were completely different. Tupac worked his way through poetry, dance, and acting before he found his true home in rap music. Rap allowed him to express everything he carried inside: the joys, the fears, the hopes, and the everyday experiences of people around him. He didn't want to be just a performer, he wanted to be a messenger. Every lyric he wrote carried meaning. Every interview he gave carried emotion. Every stage he stepped on felt like a place where he could speak on behalf of thousands who felt unseen. Michael's path was different. He was a global star by the time he was a teenager. His voice, style, and unique energy made him stand out. As he grew, so did the size of his audience. People across continents admired him. Music critics called him a genius. Fans called him a king, and performers tried to follow his footsteps. Michael loved creating music that brought joy, excitement, and connection. He believed that songs could bring people together no matter where they came from or what language they spoke. Although Tupac and Michael were both black artists who shaped culture in their own ways, they lived in separate musical worlds. Tupac's world was rooted in truth and raw emotion. Michael's world was filled with magic, imagination, and global stardom. People often wondered what might happen if these two powerful forces ever crossed paths, if the king of pop and one of the greatest poets of rap could come together. But life has a way of keeping some stars on different sides of the sky. Tupac admired Michael as a child. He respected Michael's talent, and like millions of other kids, he danced to his music and watched his performances on TV. But as Tupac grew older and became a star himself, he began to see the world differently. He started noticing how certain artists stayed connected to their communities, while others rose so high into fame that they seemed distant. He believed strongly that artists who came from challenge-filled backgrounds should remember the people who shared that background. Michael's fame was so huge that it often put him in a world of his own. Everywhere he went, crowds followed him. Cameras followed him. Reporters followed him. He lived in a reality where privacy was rare, trust was complicated, and friendships were difficult to maintain. Michael had love for people, but the size of his celebrity made it hard for him to move freely or stay grounded in the same way other artists could. While Tupac was speaking directly to the streets and communities, Michael was speaking to the globe. Tupac's songs reflected daily life, real emotions, and real people. Michael's songs reached for hearts everywhere, often focusing on hope, love, unity, and dreams. They were different, but both powerful. Yet somewhere along the way, a misunderstanding, perhaps small at first, began to form between their worlds. Tupac felt that artists should stand with the people who supported them from the beginning. He wanted big stars, especially black stars like Michael, to return to communities, uplift them, and stay connected. To Tupac, this was not just a belief but a responsibility. But Michael's life was complicated. He was constantly surrounded by expectations, studio work, rehearsals, tours, and worldwide pressures. Even when he wanted to do something meaningful, there were layers of management, schedules, and public attention that made it hard to act freely. Many decisions that appeared to be his were often influenced by teams and business structures that operated behind the scenes. As Tupac's popularity grew in the rap world, he began seeing the impact of his music. People wrote letters to him. Fans told him how his songs gave them strength or comfort. He felt connected to the streets, the young generation, and the communities that looked up to him. Tupac believed that truth was the most important thing an artist could offer. He wanted artists to be honest, not only in their music, but in the way they lived. Michael's journey showed the world something else. Greatness can come with loneliness. He inspired millions, but the more famous he became, the harder it got for him to stay grounded. People only saw the bright lights and shining performances, but they rarely saw the person behind the star. Michael carried the weight of being an international icon, and that weight grew heavier with time. In the early 1990s, both men were at important stages of their careers. Tupac was rising fast, becoming one of the most talked-about artists in hip-hop. Michael was already a legend, admired and watched by the entire world. Even though they lived in the same era, their paths never crossed in a personal way. They had no friendships, no meetings, and no collaborations. Each man was living in a world shaped by fame, but those worlds looked completely different. Tupac, surrounded by young people, creative thinkers, and close companions, spoke openly about how he viewed the entertainment industry. He talked about artists who stayed close to their communities and artists who drifted far from them. Sometimes he spoke with hope, other times with disappointment. His passion came from wanting better for his people. Michael, meanwhile, was focusing on his music, dances, and major projects. He believed in helping people quietly, often through charity or artistic work. He didn't express himself through interviews or public statements as often as Tupac did. His actions were mostly seen in his performances, videos, and humanitarian efforts. Two extraordinary lives, shaped by two extraordinary journeys, were moving along at the same time, yet had almost no direct connection. And behind the scenes, one moment was approaching that would reveal how differently they viewed the world. Tupac wanted unity, honesty, and responsibility. Michael wanted peace, creativity, and global harmony. Both visions were beautiful, just in different ways. Their stories were never meant to clash. But misunderstandings, expectations, and the demands of fame can create distance even between people who might have respected each other under different circumstances. And so, before any tension or misunderstanding ever reached the public, this is where their world stood. Tupac rising with the fire of truth inside him, and Michael shining with the light of global charm. Two stars, each powerful in his own way, slowly moving into a moment that the world would later talk about for years. As time moved forward, Tupac's career continued to rise at a steady but powerful pace. Every new project he worked on brought him deeper into the world of music, storytelling, and performance. His name began appearing in magazines, interviews, and discussions among young people everywhere. He carried a certain energy, an honesty that made people feel close to him even if they had never met him. Tupac's music spoke directly to their hearts, and his words often felt like conversations rather than songs. During this time, Tupac and his team began thinking about how he could grow even further as an artist. He was already respected for his writing and emotional depth, but he wanted to explore new sounds, new collaborations, and new ways to reach a wider audience. Tupac loved learning from different styles of music, and the idea of working with major artists always excited him. One day, while planning new ideas for an upcoming project, someone on his team brought up a suggestion that sparked attention in the room. What if we reached out to Michael Jackson? The very mention of Michael's name brought a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Michael Jackson was not just a singer, he was a global symbol of creativity, rhythm, and entertainment. Working with him would be like connecting two different musical worlds. Tupac respected Michael's talent, and even though their styles were completely different, he believed that music could always find a bridge. Tupac didn't see the idea as impossible. He believed that anything could happen if the intention was pure and the music was good. He admired Michael's talent and knew that a collaboration between them would excite fans everywhere. More importantly, it would show unity between different forms of black artistry, pop and rap, melody and poetry. So, with hope and excitement, Tupac's team reached out. They sent messages through managers, producers, and industry contacts. It wasn't unusual for artists to express interest through their teams first, especially when the star they hoped to reach lived under layers of security, management, and busy schedules. Tupac waited with hope. He wasn't expecting immediate results, but he felt confident that the idea had potential. He imagined how their voices might blend, Michael's smooth, warm tone with Tupac's emotional delivery. He imagined the kind of message they could send together, something positive, powerful, and meaningful. Days passed, then weeks. Tupac continued working on other songs, but the thought of the collaboration remained in the back of his mind. He wondered if Michael had seen the request, or if it had been caught somewhere in the business maze that surrounded the pop star. Eventually, someone from Tupac's circle told him that Michael would not be participating. The message was brief and gave no clear reason. It simply said that Michael was not interested in the collaboration at that time. The moment Tupac heard this, he didn't react loudly or angrily. Instead, he became quiet, thoughtful, and confused. He didn't understand why Michael wouldn't want to work with him. Tupac never thought of himself as more important than anyone else. But he believed in mutual respect among artists, especially artists who came from similar cultural roots. Later, Tupac learned from someone in the industry that Michael had chosen to work with another artist on a different project during that same period. The news surprised him. The artist Michael worked with was talented, but their music did not deal with the same real-life topics that Tupac often addressed. To Tupac, it didn't make sense. Tupac felt a sense of disappointment, not because he was rejected, but because he believed musicians, especially those with enormous influence, had the ability to uplift voices that were trying to bring positive change. He wasn't upset at Michael as a person. Instead, he was hurt by what the decision seemed to represent. To Tupac, it felt as though Michael was drifting further away from the communities that had celebrated him from the very beginning. Tupac had grown up in places where Michael was adored. Children in the streets sang his songs, families played his music during celebrations, and young dancers copied his moves with joy. Michael's success belonged to the world, but it also belonged to the community that first supported him. Tupac didn't want anything from Michael except connection and unity. He believed strongly that successful artists should remain close to their roots and show love to the places and people who shaped their paths. When Michael refused the collaboration, Tupac saw it as a missed opportunity, not just for a song, but for a message. Still, Tupac didn't express his feelings in a disrespectful way. He simply spoke honestly among friends and people he trusted. He talked about how important it was for artists to remain grounded. He spoke about the beauty of unity between stars who shared the same cultural experiences, and he expressed sadness that sometimes fame pulled people far away from the places they once called home. Behind the scenes, Michael probably never knew how Tupac felt. The truth is, Michael lived in a world where decisions were often filtered through advisors, contracts, and schedules. It was possible that Michael didn't personally reject the offer, perhaps the message never fully reached him, or perhaps he was busy with obligations that left little room for additional projects. His life was filled with responsibilities that few people could truly understand. But Tupac didn't know this. All he knew was that he had reached out with respect, hope, and admiration, only to be met with silence. The disappointment lingered with him. Tupac wasn't angry at Michael. Instead, he felt a kind of emotional distance, like realizing that someone you once admired might not see the world the same way you do anymore. Tupac believed in connecting with real life, with people, with truth. When he looked at Michael's world, he saw something different, something polished, distant, and protected by many layers. The people around Tupac noticed that the experience changed him slightly. It made him reflect deeply on the entertainment industry and how easily fame could separate artists from the communities they once represented. He didn't want that for himself. He promised that no matter how big he became, he would always remain close to real people and real stories. Meanwhile, Michael continued his work in his own world, unaware of the meaning Tupac had attached to the situation. He was busy with rehearsals, video shoots, music recordings, and managing his own challenges. It wasn't that Michael didn't care. It was that his life was shaped by constant movement and careful planning. As time passed, Tupac spoke occasionally about artists losing connection to their roots. He didn't mention names, but those who knew the story understood what he meant. Tupac wasn't trying to create conflict. He was simply expressing a belief he held close to his heart. And so what began as a simple request for a musical collaboration slowly grew into something much larger, a symbol of the distance between two very different worlds. Tupac represented the streets, youth, and truth. Michael represented global fame, magic, and perfection. The missed collaboration became a quiet turning point, shaping how Tupac viewed the industry and the responsibilities of artists. It was not anger, and it was not bitterness. It was simply a realization that sometimes even people who share similar beginnings can end up living in completely different realities. And that realization would eventually lead to the moment where Tupac expressed the words that echoed everywhere. "You forgot where you came from." But before that moment arrived, this silent disappointment shaped the way Tupac began to see the world around him, and it prepared the stage for everything that came next. After the news of the missed collaboration reached Tupac, something subtle changed inside him. He didn't show it in a dramatic way, and he didn't express it through anger. Instead, the feeling sat quietly in his heart, like a small cloud that didn't go away. Tupac had always believed that music was more than entertainment. It was a way to connect, to uplift others, and to show unity. So when he felt that this chance had slipped away for reasons he didn't understand, it stayed with him longer than he expected. People around Tupac noticed that he had begun thinking more deeply about fame and the responsibilities that come with it. He started talking openly during conversations about how important it was for artists to remain connected to their origins. He repeated the idea that musicians should never forget the people who supported them from the beginning. Tupac's voice was full of passion, but not frustration. It was the kind of passion that grows when someone cares deeply about something and wants to see positive change. His closest friends and team members often gathered around him while he spoke. They admired the strength of his beliefs. Tupac had a gift, not just for writing or performing, but for expressing ideas in a way that made people feel them. When he talked about staying grounded, his words carried a calm truth. He didn't speak like a celebrity. He spoke like a friend, a brother, or a mentor. One evening, while sitting with a group of friends and fellow artists, the conversation turned toward the music industry again. They were all relaxed, talking about upcoming projects, dreams, and things they hoped to achieve. At some point, someone casually mentioned the missed collaboration with Michael Jackson, and the room became quiet for a moment. Tupac inhaled deeply before speaking. His voice was steady, and his expression showed thought rather than frustration. "You know," he said softly, "I just wish people wouldn't forget where they came from." Everyone listened closely. They respected Tupac's sincerity. They knew he wasn't speaking out of dislike. He was speaking out of understanding. Understanding how easy it was for fame to change the world around a person. He continued, "When you come from a certain place, when you know the world the way we know it, you should use your success to shine a light on those places, not forget them, not distance yourself, but connect with them even more." There was no bitterness in his tone. There was sadness, yes, and maybe disappointment. But beneath all of that was love. Love for his community, love for his culture, and love for the idea of artists working together to make a positive difference. Some of the people in the room nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Others felt a quiet sense of admiration because Tupac wasn't afraid to speak on matters that others avoided. It wasn't easy to talk about such topics, especially when they involved someone as respected as Michael. But Tupac wasn't attacking Michael as a person. He was speaking about a system, a pattern he had seen many times, artists rising to great heights and then drifting far from the communities that shaped them. Word of Tupac's feelings eventually spread slowly through conversations in the music world. The entertainment industry is a place where stories travel quickly, even when no one intends for them to. People who were in the room shared his comments with others, not to create drama, but because Tupac's words had meaning, and meaning has a way of moving from person to person. Soon, interviews began to capture glimpses of Tupac's thoughts. When reporters asked him about the industry, he would answer honestly. He didn't mention names and he didn't say anything harsh. Instead, he spoke about staying true to one's origins, supporting the community, and remaining grounded no matter how high you rise. His answers were thoughtful, sometimes emotional, and always sincere. Fans noticed this change too. They heard the passion in Tupac's interviews, and many of them felt the same way he did. They appreciated that he wasn't afraid to bring up subjects that mattered. Tupac's honesty was one of the reasons people connected with him so strongly. He didn't pretend to be perfect, and he didn't pretend to understand everything, but he always spoke from the heart. At times, people close to Michael's world heard whispers of Tupac's comments. Some wondered if Michael even knew about any of this. Michael's life was filled with busy schedules, planning, traveling, and working on major projects. He often stayed away from the media, and he avoided situations that brought unnecessary stress. Because of this, it was very likely that the messages Tupac was expressing never truly reached Michael directly. Still, as more people talked about Tupac's feelings, the story began to change shape in the hands of outsiders. When stories move from person to person, they sometimes grow or twist. Tupac's thoughtful comments, meant to encourage connection, slowly began turning into headlines that suggested conflict. And once the media became aware of the topic, they began shaping it in their own way. But before the media twisted anything, before the world began to discuss it, Tupac continued to speak among the people he trusted most. He expressed that successful artists should help those who were trying to come up. He talked about gratitude, humility, and staying connected to the communities that lifted you. One day, during a quiet moment with a friend, Tupac shared what was in his heart more personally. He said, "I don't want to see anyone forget the people who believed in them first. When you climb higher, you have to lift others with you. Otherwise, what's the point?" His friend nodded, seeing the sincerity in Tupac's eyes. This wasn't about competition. It wasn't about comparing artists. It wasn't about pride. It was about responsibility, something that Tupac felt deeply. For him, music was not just about performing. It was about representation. It was about giving voice to those who didn't have one. It was about making sure that young people in challenging places knew that someone who came from their world cared about them. In Tupac's view, Michael had reached a level of greatness that hardly anyone in history had reached. And with such greatness, Tupac believed, came an even greater responsibility to stay close to the people who loved you from the beginning. While Tupac's disappointment grew quietly, it wasn't overwhelming. He still respected Michael's achievements. He still admired his talent. But the situation made Tupac think deeply about what fame can do to a person. It made him more determined to never lose his own connection to the real world. He promised himself silently, "I will never forget where I came from." Over time, these thoughts built up inside him, not in an explosive way, but in a steady, reflective way. It was like a truth that repeated itself in his mind. And because Tupac was someone who expressed himself through poetry, music, interviews, and conversations, the thought eventually made its way into his words. Those simple, emotional words. You forgot where you came from. These words were not meant to hurt anyone. They were meant to remind, to reflect, and to encourage artists everywhere to stay grounded and connected. And as Tupac continued speaking his truth, the world around him began to react, turning his sincere feelings into a public discussion, one that would grow much bigger than he intended. As Tupac's gentle but honest comments quietly moved from conversation to conversation, the music world slowly began to buzz. Most people understood the heart behind his words. They knew Tupac wasn't trying to disrespect anyone. They knew he cared deeply about community, unity, and the role of artists in lifting people up. But the entertainment industry isn't always a place where messages stay pure. Sometimes, even the softest words can turn into loud stories. It started with a few small articles. Entertainment reporters heard that Tupac had spoken about artists staying connected to their roots. They didn't know the full story, so they began filling in the empty spaces with their own ideas. They wrote that Tupac was disappointed in certain artists. They hinted that he was talking about someone extremely famous. They didn't say Michael's name at first, but the clues were there, and readers quickly made assumptions. Then, as days went by, the story began to grow. Headlines began appearing with dramatic tones like, "Tupac speaks out," or "tension between music icons." Even though Tupac hadn't said anything dramatic, the headlines created a sense of excitement and curiosity. People love stories about famous figures. They love discussions, debates, and speculation. And this story had everything the media liked. Two major stars, two different worlds, and a misunderstood message. Soon, larger magazines and talk shows picked up the story. They began discussing it publicly as if it were a direct conflict. Most of the people talking about it hadn't even heard Tupac's real words. They had only read the headlines or heard someone else's version. But that didn't stop them from turning it into a topic that people everywhere began talking about. Reporters started asking fans for their thoughts. Some fans believed Tupac's message made sense. They appreciated his honesty and believed he had spoken from a place of care. Others felt that Michael, being such a global figure, had different responsibilities and challenges that people didn't fully understand. Fans began sharing opinions, sometimes softly, sometimes passionately, and soon the conversation started spreading much faster. Radio hosts played a big part in it, too. Every day, people tuned in to hear music and news, and the hosts would bring up the story. Some hosts tried to explain Tupac's message clearly, but others exaggerated it to make their shows more exciting. They would say things like, "Did Tupac call out Michael Jackson?" Or, "Is there a disagreement between the king of pop and the poet of rap?" The hosts asked these questions even though no real disagreement had taken place. Meanwhile, Michael Jackson remained silent, as he always did during situations involving rumors. He rarely spoke about controversy. He preferred to let music speak for him. But his silence made people wonder even more. Some believed he had heard Tupac's comments. Others believed he didn't know anything about it. Either way, the silence became part of the story. People close to Michael tried to keep his world calm. They didn't bring unnecessary stress to him. They focused on his rehearsals, his projects, and his creative plans. Michael's team understood how the media worked. They knew that stories grew, changed, and disappeared all the time. So they decided it was best to ignore the noise. But the world doesn't ignore stories easily. especially stories involving beloved music legends. Soon, magazines began printing long articles comparing Tupac and Michael. They discussed their childhoods, their careers, their influence, and even their personalities. They painted Tupac as the passionate truth teller, and Michael as the global entertainer living in a different realm. While both images held truth, the media began shaping the narrative in ways neither man had asked for. People on the street started talking too. Young fans of Tupac said they respected him even more for speaking openly. Fans of Michael defended him, saying he was misunderstood and often judged unfairly. In stores, parks, classrooms, and barbershops, people debated about the responsibility of famous stars. The conversations grew, and soon it felt like the whole world was participating in a discussion that Tupac had never intended to become so big. On talk shows, celebrity guests were asked to give their opinions. Some praised Tupac for caring deeply about community. Others said Michael's global responsibilities made his world complicated. Everyone had something to say, and although many comments were respectful, the constant discussion added energy to the situation. Tupac saw some of these headlines. He heard some of the radio shows. At first, he was surprised by how much attention his simple comments had received. He had spoken from the heart, not from anger. But now the world was treating it as something larger, something dramatic, something it was never meant to be. He didn't want a spotlight on this topic. He didn't want people to think he was creating conflict. But Tupac also knew he couldn't control how the media interpreted things. So instead of responding loudly or defensively, he continued to express himself in the only way he knew how, with honesty. He kept talking about unity, truth, and the importance of remembering your roots. He never mentioned Michael's name. He never criticized him directly. He only continued sharing his beliefs. And because his words were rooted in sincerity, people kept listening. But as the story grew, so did the misunderstandings. Some magazines began publishing imaginative versions of events, suggesting situations that never happened. They wrote about supposed feuds, arguments, or secret tensions, even though none of it was true. They created dramatic headlines to draw attention, and the story stretched farther and farther from the truth. Michael, on his side, remained calm. His world was different. He was focused on creating music, working on performances, traveling, and preparing for future projects. He had learned long ago that it was better to remain quiet during public discussions. He often believed that giving attention to rumors gave them more power. So he stayed silent, surrounded by his team, fans, and the comfort of creating new art. This silence, however, became more fuel for the story. People interpreted it in different ways. Some said Michael was hurt. Some said he didn't care. Some even said he agreed with Tupac quietly. But the truth was simple. Michael was just living his life, unaware of the deep meaning Tupac had placed on the missed collaboration. As the public conversation continued, the entertainment world realized something important. This wasn't just a discussion about two artists. It had become a conversation about the role of fame, responsibility, cultural roots, and the connection between artists and the communities that shaped them. Tupac's message had opened a bigger door. Many young artists began thinking about the subject too. They asked themselves, what does it mean to stay connected to your roots? Tupac's words had planted seeds of thought in countless minds. Artists began appreciating the idea of giving back, staying close to real people, and remembering their beginnings. Meanwhile, fans of Michael continued to celebrate his music and achievements. They loved him for his creativity, kindness, and ability to bring joy. They believed that he cared for people in his own way, through charity, messages of unity, and global love. And they were right. Michael had always tried to lift people up, even if he expressed it differently than Tupac. Slowly, the story became more than a headline. It became a reflection of two very different worlds, one grounded in real-life storytelling and one built on global dreams. Although the media had spun it into a dramatic narrative, the heart of the story still held a truth. Both artists cared deeply, but they communicated that care through different paths. By the time the story reached its peak, it was clear that something bigger was happening. People weren't just talking about Tupac or Michael anymore. They were talking about the culture, the community, and the meaning of staying connected to where you come from. And without ever speaking to each other, Tupac and Michael had created a moment in history, one built not on conflict, but on reflection. A moment shaped by misunderstanding, yes, but also shaped by passion, care, and the voice of a generation. The world kept watching, wondering what would happen next, unaware that this conversation, one that neither artist had planned, was shaping their legacies in ways they never expected. As the public conversation continued to grow, both Tupac and Michael remained in their own worlds, following their own paths, unaware of how deeply the story was beginning to settle in the minds of people everywhere. Even though the media had shaped the narrative into something larger than life, the truth behind it remained simple. Two artists with extraordinary influence were standing on opposite sides of the same sky, each living a different reality, each misunderstood in a different way. In quiet moments, Tupac thought often about the situation. Not because he wanted attention, and not because he wanted to create a dramatic moment in the industry, but because he cared deeply about what his words represented. He believed that artists carried a responsibility, not one forced upon them, but one born naturally from the love and support they received from people who connected with their art. Tupac's dream was not to criticize anyone, especially not someone like Michael, whom he had admired since he was young. His intention had always been to inspire artists to stay close to their communities and to use their success to create positive change. He wanted young people to see examples of unity, cooperation, and support. When he said, "You forgot where you came from," it wasn't meant as an insult, but as a reminder, not just for Michael, but for any artist who might drift away from the roots that shaped them. But the world around him had turned the message into something much louder. Tupac watched as newspapers, radio hosts, and talk shows discussed his words as if they belonged to a dramatic story. At times, he felt frustrated, not because people were talking, but because the heart of his message was being overshadowed by the excitement of the narrative. Still, Tupac continued to speak with kindness, thoughtfulness, and calm honesty. He never tried to escalate the situation. He never pointed fingers. If anything, he became more focused on expressing his belief that staying grounded was important. Fans noticed the sincerity, and many appreciated how he handled the growing attention. Meanwhile, in Michael's world, life moved forward, as it always had. Michael was surrounded by music, creativity, and the constant movement of worldwide fame. Even if he heard pieces of the story, he didn't react publicly. That was never his style. He believed in responding through music, kindness, and quiet actions, rather than through public conversations. His silence didn't mean he disagreed or agreed. It simply meant that he didn't want to turn attention toward confusion or misunderstanding. People close to Michael sometimes wondered how he felt about the situation, but Michael rarely shared personal feelings about public discussions. He preferred to protect his peace and focus on spreading positivity. At the same time, he continued to support charities, help children, and create music that inspired millions. These actions reflected his heart more clearly than any interview ever could. As weeks passed, the story began changing. The dramatic tone softened, and the noise slowly settled into something more reflective. People started thinking more deeply about the themes that had surfaced. Fans, artists, students, and entire communities talked about the importance of remembering one's background. Teachers used Tupac's message to encourage students to be proud of their families and communities. Young musicians discussed how to stay humble even if they achieved success. In a way, the story created a conversation that neither Tupac nor Michael had expected, but one that touched many lives. Tupac, continuing his rising career, felt grateful that his message still carried meaning despite all the noise created around it. His interviews became even more thoughtful. He spoke about growth, understanding, and beauty in unity. He reminded people that no matter how far someone travels in life, their roots stay with them. He wanted people to feel proud of where they came from, no matter how simple or challenging their background was. Michael, too, kept evolving through his music. As always, he delivered messages of peace, love, harmony, and hope to the world. His songs reminded people that kindness could cross oceans, that dreams could unite people, and that music could speak where words sometimes failed. Michael had a strong desire to bring people together, even if he expressed it differently from Tupac. As time passed, both artists continued to shape culture in their own unique ways. Tupac's lyrics reached deep into the hearts of young people who were searching for strength, honesty, and direction. Michael's performances continued to bring joy to crowds across the world, lifting spirits and creating unforgettable memories. Years later, when people looked back at this moment between Tupac and Michael, this moment that was never a direct conflict, but rather a reflection, they began to understand it with more balance. Historians, fans, and scholars realized that it wasn't a feud. It was a misunderstood conversation shaped by media interpretation. People saw that Tupac had been speaking about responsibility, connection, and community. They understood that his comments were never meant as an attack, but as a heartfelt reminder rooted in love for his culture. They also realized that Michael's silence was not avoidance. It was the way he protected his calm in a world where everything he said could become global news. Looking back, the moment held a quiet beauty. It represented two different ways of expressing care: Tupac's direct honesty and Michael's gentle silence. Both cared deeply, but their worlds were so different that their paths never aligned long enough for them to truly understand each other. As years turned into decades, the story softened into a lesson. People spoke about Tupac's passion and Michael's kindness with equal respect. Fans of both artists grew to appreciate that their differences didn't make one right or wrong. They simply reflected different kinds of journeys. In interviews long after the moment passed, many artists expressed how this story influenced them. Some said Tupac's message reminded them to stay close to their families. Others said Michael's graceful silence taught them to rise above misunderstanding. Both lessons carried wisdom, and both came from hearts that cared deeply in their own ways. Even though Tupac and Michael never had a personal conversation about the situation, the world treated it as if they had spoken through the air, communicating through ideas rather than words. This unspoken dialogue became a part of their legacies, a gentle, unexpected reminder that great artists can inspire deep conversations even without meeting each other. In classrooms, young people continued reading Tupac's words, finding motivation in his honesty. In living rooms around the world, families continued dancing to Michael's songs, feeling joy in his creativity. And through these experiences, both artists continued to touch lives long after their stories on Earth ended. In the end, the story of Tupac calling out Michael wasn't really about disagreement. It wasn't about distance. It wasn't about conflict at all. It was about reflection on fame, community, responsibility, and what it means to rise from humble beginnings. It reminded the world that success is a journey shaped by many hands, many hearts, and many moments, and that no matter how high one climbs, the place where they started will always be an important part of who they are. Tupac's words, "You forgot where you came from," became more than a comment. They became an invitation for everyone to think about their roots, their path, and their sense of gratitude. Michael's silence, too, became meaningful. It reminded people that kindness doesn't always need explanation, and that staying true to oneself can be a quiet, steady strength. Together, without planning it, without speaking, without meeting, Tupac and Michael created a moment that taught the world something valuable. that greatness comes in many forms, but humility and remembrance keep it human. And so, the story closes gently, leaving behind a message that continues to echo softly across generations. Never forget where you came from. Never forget who lifted you. And never forget that even the biggest stars are shaped by small beginnings.